Let's see. What's happening? Chris? What's going on?
Nothing.
Okay.
You, but I can't see.
Okay, so what's going on? What just happened? Should we stop sharing and reconvene it? Okay, there we are. So what's this thing here? Hang on, Chris. What's this? I got rid of this. Get rid of this. Okay. We're good, right?
Yeah.
Everyone hear me? I presume they do, right? So, yeah. Okay. So, hi, everybody. And thank you all for joining us for the Wabinar. I suspect some of you are sort of wondering how Webinar became Wabinar, and the issue was that I decided to personalize it so that I sort of came up with what I thought was a kind of cheesy way of redescribing the webinar, and get that as a bit of a conversation entry piece. But here we are, and so again, thank you to all who are attending the webinar. And permettez-moi aussi de dire que même si la présentation va être en anglais, je suis toujours, comme vous savez probablement, capable de répondre en français et même dans d'autres langues si ceci a lieu. Aujourd'hui, today, the presentation is going to be about, as you're all aware, Canadian opinion of intergroup relations selected groups and viewing expressions of hate in the midst of international tension, more specifically what is occurring currently in the Middle East right now. It's not an easy topic, as I'm sure you can all appreciate. There's a high degree of sensitivity. I'm not just talking about the issues themselves, which of course lend themselves to a fair bit of emotion and a fair bit of tension, but also in terms of undertaking studies or surveys in this particular field requires a good deal of caution and attention and care in terms of the selection of the questions, the actual words selected when the questions are formulated. So, which of course I'm always giving a fair bit of consideration to and discussing with people prior to going to the field, notably with my partner, Leger Marketing, that does the actual field work. We're responsible for the question formulation. And so I've tried as much as possible to stay consistent with the types of questions that we have formulated previously. Now, that may or may not lend itself to an optimal outcome, and there may be some nuance and there may be some other ways of asking questions. And I'm looking for suggestions going forward in terms of the way in which questions are formulated in this area, right? And again, keeping in mind that in terms of question formulation, what I aim to do with my research team is make the questions as neutral as possible, right? So that, for example, you'll get questions on net concern. There are many ways of phrasing the issue of net worried means very worried or somewhat worried or not very worried or not worried at all. And what you'll see in this type of sort of outcome from the survey question or results from the survey findings is the net worried, which is those people saying, I am very or somewhat worried, right? So I've tried to stay, going back, as consistent as possible in terms of the wording we've used in previous surveys. That's also true for the second section of what I'm going to present, which is on positive or negative opinion of selected groups, right? So there it's been very positive, somewhat negative, or very negative in terms of the way in which the responses are given to the list of the groups that are included in the survey. And there too, I've tried to stay consistent with what we've asked in the past with respect to the identification of the groups involved, but I have added some groups that were not previously in the sort of standard surveys we've done for tracking purposes, given the nature of the issue that we're addressing. The third question, which is looking at expressions of hate, that one again, some nuance in the question formulation, rather than asking, have you observed an increase, decrease, or sort of the status quo with respect to the expression of hate in media, the nuance there was, rather than referring only to social media, which is generally what we'll measure in previous iterations of these kinds of surveys that we've done over the past sort of 10 years, if you'd like, I generalized it to media at large. So it's sort of was social media as an example of whether you've seen an increase in the expression of hate in media, and provide, as I said, the combination in terms of suggested types of media of television, radio, print, and social media. So previous to this survey, the focus would have been exclusively on social media, but here I've widened the spectrum, if you like, of the type of media which some will be, where some will make observations about hate or not. Now, in the follow-up question on that, and again, just giving you the background here, I'm going to show you the actual results, obviously. In the follow-up to that, I asked an open-ended question on which groups you've observed have been the object of the hate expression that you've seen. So that question was only directed at those people who said they've seen an increase, or if you like, an uptick in the expression of hate on media, in this case, any kind of traditional media or social media. So and it was in an open-ended question, so no sort of previously provided list of groups. Just get your sort of immediate reaction, and you could give more than one response to that. So the cumulative outcome of that is going to be more than 100%, given that I've invited you to make up to 2 responses in terms of what you've observed. So that's the background to this survey. And of course, we could go and unpack some of this more deeply, which is something that we may choose to do in future, but for the purposes of this survey, it's a bit more top line. Now, also, I wanted to mention that with the abuse of the SPSS files, I don't know that all of you are familiar with what SPSS is, but it's a data program that permits you to do sort of correlations, crosstabs, multivariate analysis. I'm going to show you something that's a bit more detailed than what was available on the website, or rather available currently on our website, and or has been reported in the media. So I did want to, for the purposes of doing this, go a little further than what was available on our website. Otherwise, my assumption was you could have simply gone to our website and saw the results. So I'm going to share that with you right now, actually. And if there are questions either in the last half hour in the chat, feel free to do so. Hopefully we'll be able to answer as much as possible. And again, ideally, I invite people to wait till they see the full presentation before jumping in with the questions. But, if you feel that, you want to get your question ready, feel free to do so. And if we're not able to answer the questions over the course of the next 45 minutes or 50 minutes, then, we'll collect them and see if we can provide responses thereafter. Right, so here we go. So basically, just in terms of methodology, this was done during the period October 27 to 29, 2023. There are 1,632 Canadians were surveyed. It's a web-based panel survey, so it's what's called a non-probability sample, and so its margin of error would be 2.5, 19 times out of 20 as an equivalent margin of error. That's why it's called probability, because you can't assign margins of error to these types of surveys since they're not randomized, but that would be the equivalent in a sort of randomized survey. Okay, so net worried about relations between the following groups. Jews and Muslims yielded the highest degree of net worry or concern amongst Canadians, and you could see that 55%, a majority of Canadians are worried about that relationship. The relationships that, across the sort of spectrum here that are the object of less concern are relations between Christians and non-Christians, Asian and non-Asian, Black and other, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, 36% express net worry. So, what I'm going to talk about a bit more is how the landscape in terms of both negative and positive sentiment towards groups hate expression, and so forth shift because they can be very much event oriented, right? Not surprising, as we've sort of probably in thinking about this through a sort of long-term context. When there are big international events, there's more focus, and media gets more focused on the events, and it tends to create a sort of displacement in terms of where people direct their attention and how that attention gets translated into attitudes and or behaviors, right? So you can see, by the way, if we look over here, that there's a fairly significant gap in terms of the extent to which the concern or worry in this case is felt by the under 35 cohort at 43% versus the 55 plus cohort, which seems to be considerably more concerned about the state of that relationship at 67%. And, you know, that's generally true for some of the other relationships identified here, right, in the sort of 58% on this end to 43, not in terms of immigrants, non-immigrants. And I should say, you know, even though I don't gather it's not sort of the central topic that some of you may be interested in, the immigrant, non-immigrant concern at 45% is higher than what we're accustomed to in terms of the previous tracking in this particular area, right? Again, keeping that in context of some of the other relationships that are being measured here, right? So that's just to be kept in mind. But in general, right, the biggest age spectrum gap is in that higher cohort, 55 plus, sort of baby boom thereabouts, relative to the 35 plus, right, where you're seeing a substantial gap in the net level of concern in that regard. So net negative opinion. So in terms of net negative opinions, right, we can see here that the highest net negative opinion amongst Canadians is towards Islam, right? And then it's actually there's a fairly sizable gap between that negativity and negative opinion expressed towards other groups defined either as persons or as groups, right? So you'll see the higher negative, if you like, ratings are directed more at religion than they are at the religions than they are at people. So if you look at Judaism, for example, it's a 20% negative rating. If you look at Canadian Jews, it's 12%. Similarly, a 14-point gap between Islam and Canadian Muslims, right? So the negative ratings are lower for peoples than they are for the religions themselves. Some of that, by the way, is being affected by opinion in Quebec, where we know negative opinion, not something that's particularly new, is considerably higher amongst Quebecers towards what they would describe, some at least, as organized religion, right? So it's here it's 17 points over the national average in Quebec, and for Judaism, it's 10 points over the national average. Actually, for Christians, there's not much of a difference in Quebec, right, between the negative rating nationally and the negative rating that Quebecers attach to Christians in that regard. So it's sort of my bad on that, because to be fair, I would have thought I put Christianity. I have to check with Leger why Christianity got translated into Christians. But anyways, that's sort of the outcome, which I'll correct in a forthcoming survey should we proceed to do another one in the next 2-3 weeks to see how this thing evolves and what the track looks like. Right. So lowest negative opinion is of Black Canadians, actually at 12%. So Indigenous peoples, 19%, right? Immigrants, 23% negative opinions. Now, on the flip side of it, okay, so this is negative opinions. I've broken it down by age cohorts, right? You saw the province. So this is age and gender. For the most part, you can see women have much lower negative opinion than men in terms of Islam. That's probably very true in Quebec as well. Again, age cohorts, 13-point gap there. And let's see. So now we go through this and right. So age cohorts, not substantial gaps, the bigger gaps in terms of net negative opinion, right? On this, as I said, Islam, this older age cohort, nothing much here. Nothing here in the base of age. No, nothing there. So yeah, Jews, it's actually the inverse. The more negative opinion of Canadian Jews is held in the 18 to 34 cohort. The older cohort, 9%. So it's lower in the older cohorts than the younger cohort. Other than that, again, men more almost across the proverbial board. Men express more negative opinion towards the whole spectrum of groups than do women, almost at 10 points for each one of the groups, right? You could see So there's more of this hostility amongst the males and amongst females. Net negative opinion here. Sorry, let me just flip through here. Yeah, this is no. Okay, so net negative opinion here. Canadian Muslims, right? Immigrants, Indigenous peoples. Right, so you're seeing these are the sort of net negative opinion over the past 4 years. There's been little change in negative opinion directed at identified minorities, but rising negative views of immigrants, right? So you can see here that actually it's not so much the negative opinion that's really shifted since 2019 to today, right, across these particular groups. Yeah, no shift there, right? Yeah, no shift really dramatic. That's not what we're seeing that's changed as much as you may presume it's changed if you go back over those previous slides I just shared with you. Net positive opinion. So these are just net positive opinion, right? Again, but the inverse of what I was showing you earlier in terms of net negative opinion. You're seeing that across the spectrum for these groups. And Black Canadians actually rated the highest in terms of positive opinion. Right, we're seeing here that right there's again the spectrum here. The net positive opinion is lowest for Islam. That makes sense. It's the inverse of what we saw earlier. For the most part, the majority of Canadians, other than for Islam, the majority of Canadians are expressing net positive opinions of all the groups. There's variation, right? So here's you can see the variation here. But again, the religions seem to rate disproportionately lower in terms of net negative opinion. Some of that having to do, I said, shifted a bit with Quebec's sort of views in terms of positive and negative opinion for these groups. Positive opinion. So Indigenous people in Canada get less positive views than Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Again, overall, this is positive opinion by regions. So there's some regional variation. You could see the regional variation. Lower positive opinion for Indigenous persons here, right, at 52 and 57% respectively in terms of positive opinion. Oh, again, there's variation regionally here. Quebec has got the lowest positive opinion for Islam. The highest would be in Atlantic Canada at 46%, right? Again, some variations across the board. Quebec lower in Judaism by about 10 points and much lower than, for example, Atlantic Canada or Ontario in terms of net positive opinions. You can see in Quebec that positive opinion, Muslims 47%. So it's much higher than Islam, right, in terms of positive versus negative opinion. So again, it gets back to this issue of the and that's Christians, not Christianity, actually. Okay, so now we go into hate expression. How much time do I have? I have about 7 minutes, but I might take a couple minutes more because actually there are some other slides that I have not found their way into this presentation that I'm going to go dig back for in about once I complete this. So this is hate expression over the past few weeks, right? So you could see that there are substantial percentages of Canadians that say over the past weeks they've witnessed an increase in hate expression or hateful comments in the media, right? At 45%. No change 35%, don't know 16%, decrease 4%. Mainly it's 55 plus that are seeing that increased hate expression in the media. The reason, by the way, that's happening, and because usually this is inverted, more young people will see hate expression or hateful comments than will 55 plus, persons 55 plus. But the reason that's happening is because I introduced TV, radio, and print. Because if it's just social media, which is what we ask generally, given the disproportionate consumption of social media in the 18 to 34 cohort, they will usually see more hate expression. But because we've introduced the general media, right, more widespread, you're seeing that it's the 55 plus that are seeing more expression of hate than the younger cohort, 18 to 34. You're seeing lesser degrees of expression of hate amongst Atlantic Canadians and Quebecers, at least in terms of their perceived perception around whether there's an increase or not. Ontario is the highest at 50%, as is BC at 49%. Now I go to the open-ended question as to where you've seen those expressions of hate, right? And it's basically here. So again, it's an open-ended question. You can name one or two groups so that people are seeing in that open-ended question. 27% are seeing Jewish as the group, or Jews that are the object of hate, and more men than women, but fewer young people, the 17-18 1834, far fewer young people are seeing that relative to 55 plus group, right? Case of Palestinians or Palestine, 25% are seeing hate expression or hateful comments. No big distinction on the basis of gender, but young people are saying they're seeing that more so than are people in those age cohorts 35 plus. Israel or Israelis, you're seeing it at 23%, 20 more women than men saying they're seeing it. More young people are seeing it than the 55 plus cohort, right? Muslims and Islam, it's a fair bit lower in terms of hate expression, 9%, right? Are saying they're seeing hate expression directed at Muslims or Islam, 9, 9, 9, 8, 12. So that's what it's showing there. So again, some sort of distinctions in here in terms of how you unpack these issues. And so, which I want to show you something about momentarily. Now, for the rest, we're seeing much lower rates of observed hate expression. Again, and this question was only asked to those people who said they observed increases in hate expression over the past few weeks. And so what they're seeing is much lower expressions of hate towards some groups that are very often the object of hate expression or hateful comments on social media. So it'd be Blacks, LGBTQ plus, Indigenous, immigrant, very low. It's interesting because if you look at net negative opinions of these groups versus hate expression, you'll see much higher negative opinion of some of these groups as expressed in the earlier slides, but very little hate expression. So it's showing you that the nature of what's happening globally is seeing a shift in the extent to which we see hate expression directed at groups that are, you know, in outside of this sort of the international crises and associated tension are more often the object of hate expression than what we would otherwise see. So that provides us kind of useful insights, I think, for those of us who are collectively working to fight racism and the expression of hate in terms of the way we see that sort of massive shift in terms of where hate expression is getting situated currently. So this is just looking at, as I said, that sort of negative net negatives, right? Of net negative opinion of selected groups. You can see Indigenous peoples, so 19%, right, for October. But in terms of what was witnessed as hate expression, it's 2%, right? So Chinese Canadians, net negative opinion 15%, but there's people seeing no mentions of hate expression towards Chinese Canadians, even though during the COVID period, there was disproportionately high rates of hate expression in social media and other media towards this group. So a very sort of a seismic shift in rates of negative opinion relative to hate expression, the sort of relationship between attitudes people hold and acting upon those attitudes or engaging in behavior that's a reflection of those attitudes and the activation of that, right? So where we're seeing, you know, all kinds of interesting trends. Immigrants from 23% negative, which is high, to 1% in terms of hate expression, despite the fact that we're seeing a lot of, in other polling we've done, a lot of concern about immigration levels, right? So it's just not, at least in the past few weeks, spilling over into what people are seeing in media or social media. So that's the story with that. Now, I have a few other slides and I want to get to them. I could, maybe what we'll do is, as I go to the other slides, let me see, I have to sort of, I may need some technical help on this thing. So Chris, actually, I apologize. Yeah, let's take about, let's try to take some questions or some comments. So what it is, hang on a sec. Let's get some questions and comments. Sorry, the issue is that I have a second PowerPoint and that has some of those more detailed tables. Somehow that's not the one I presented, but I'm only missing the 4 additional slides. So Denise has a question. Denise? Let me,
What do you see, Denise?
I just saw a raised hand, Denise. Patricia, there's more hands raised. Yeah, Patricia, go ahead. Patricia, you have to do this from here, is it?
I'll have to unmute.
Okay, Patricia, if you unmute, it would help me to. Patricia?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you now. Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
Excellent. That's it. Thank you. Sorry, I'm late. I don't know.
No, don't worry about it. And I apologize. I have a few other slides, and somehow what happened was they didn't get included in this PowerPoint. But I will, I'll get them online, and we'll show you the balance of the presentation. But at this point, I think we can stop anyways and take a few questions because there's a fair bit to digest. So. Sorry, go ahead, Patricia. Yeah. Patricia, you're muted again.
I wanted to let you know that I wasn't hearing you, but now I think it's okay. And to apologize, I'm late for the session. Okay, I'm late.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was it. Okay. All right. That was easy. Anybody else? Denise. Denise, tu as une question? Je t'entends pas parce qu'il y a le mute. Tu es sur mute.
OK. OK. Tu as fait un dernier commentaire sur ta dernière diapositive disant qu'il y avait un écart assez étonnant entre la perception négative du groupe et la perception de sa victimologie. Et tu as donné l'exemple, par exemple, je pense, je ne sais plus si c'est des Arabes ou des Juifs, en tous les cas. Alors, par exemple, disons, il y a une opinion négative d'un groupe à 25%, mais la perception qu'il est victime de haine est de 1%. Comment t'expliques ça?
D'abord, laisse-moi clarifier la question et je vais répondre, si ça ne te dérange pas, en français d'abord et en anglais après, juste parce que je veux m'assurer que tout le monde soit de comprendre. Dans un premier temps, la première question portait plutôt sur le degré auquel les gens ont une opinion négative ou positive des groupes sur la liste. Alors, mettons qu'ils ont une opinion négative des immigrants ou négative dans ce cas-là des immigrants, mettons à 25%. La deuxième question et à porter sur le degré auquel les gens ont vu depuis 3 semaines, pour ceux et celles qui ont vu de l'opinion, de l'expression de la haine, sur quel groupe ils ont vu cette expression de la haine. Tout ceci pour dire, si je résume, que un pourcentage beaucoup plus élevé des gens ont une opinion négative des immigrants que ceux qui disent qu'ils ont vu sur les médias sociaux, d'autres médias, l'expression de la haine ou des commentaires haineux envers les immigrants dans ce cas-là ou envers d'autres groupes. C'est ça l'écart de laquelle je parle. Ce n'est pas la victimologie.
Oui, ça j'ai compris, Jack. Ma question, c'est...
Ce n'est pas la victimologie, c'est le degré auquel les gens ont vu ça. Alors, c'est ça. Alors, la conclusion pour moi, c'était que dans l'espace ou dans le contexte présent, ceux qui expriment des commentaires haineux dans les médias ou qui sont perçus avec le faire sont beaucoup moins aptes dernièrement à le faire sur les immigrants ou sur les gens, la population chinoise du Canada ou ces autres groupes. C'est un peu comme si les commentaires haineux et les médias sociaux et autres se sont déplacés, right? Ou le bassin des gens qui ont des sentiments négatifs ont déplacé ce genre de sentiments envers quelques groupes, notamment les Juifs, les Palestiniens, les Israéliens et les musulmans, en moindre mesure. Do you understand that? So basically, Denise's question was that last table, which is a key table. I don't, I think in terms of providing insight, what it's suggesting is, on the one hand, those people, those Canadians who say, I have a negative view of group X, say immigrants, for example, say it's 1 in 5 Canadians that have negative view of immigrants. Very few people are observing negative comments, or in this case, hateful comments expressed via social media targeting immigrants. So there's a big, big gap. And that's true for some of the other groups as well. Indigenous peoples, LGBTQ+, are the object of very, very little currently, in this past sort of 3 weeks to a month, the object of the expression of hateful comments or on social media or other media, because there's been a shift in the extent to which what's appearing in social media is currently targeting according to what Canadians say they're seeing. And what they're primarily seeing in terms of who or what's being targeted are Jews, Palestinians, and Israelis, and to a lesser extent Muslims, in terms of what type of hate expression is appearing in social media. So that's it. Sorry, Denise, you wanted to follow up further?
No, it's okay. I'm not convinced, but okay. I have to think about it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I know. I to be fair, Denise, I have to think about it too. To be fair, there's there's a lot to think about in terms of what, all this is telling us. I'm sharing with you the sort of top line, type of results, but there's a lot to think about arising from this. And part of what I think we need to think about is the challenge of measuring these types of things in the sort of at these times of sort of international or global tensions, and how you can thoughtfully measure it and thoughtfully sort of generate conclusions from it.
Yeah, okay.
So, because I need to think about that. To be fair, je dois réfléchir encore pour ce qui est la suite. Comment est-ce que je mesure? Parce que en fait, je peux aller plus en profondeur en posant d'autres questions, right? Pour mieux cerner, si on veut, ce que les gens voient. Je n'ai pas demandé ce que les gens ont vu spécifiquement. J'ai juste demandé quels groupes étaient les groupes cibles en termes de ce que vous avez vu dans les médias. Je n'ai pas demandé qu'est-ce que vous avez vu spécifiquement. Quelle sorte? C'était quoi le contenu de l'expression de la haine?
Non, mais ça peut être aussi, ça peut être aussi le fait que les médias, comme tu l'as dit, ont switché beaucoup plus sur certains groupes. Donc l'opinion, la perception change.
Oui, d'accord. Oui.
OK.
Oui, et je peux aussi poser la question, qu'est-ce que vous regardez? Quels sont les médias sociaux que vous consommez?
Oui,
Il y a pas mal d'autres questions qu'on peut poser. Pour l'instant,
et surtout
pour l'instant,
demander...
je suis allé jusqu'à ce où les ressources qui me limitent dans le contexte actuel me permettent de présenter et de susciter de la réflexion quant à ce que ceci veut dire. Mais on peut aller plus loin. Et justement, quant à la réflexion d'aller plus loin, je vais déterminer avec d'autres personnes qu'est-ce qu'on peut poser comme question.
Okay.
So it's kind of like that. It's not, but this is a very challenging, this is a very challenge. I find this a very challenging area to measure, so anyway.
Jack,
John.
we have several questions here in the chat. Yeah. No, I'm gonna because we have some questions from a little while ago in the Q&A. I'm just gonna give people the opportunity to ask their questions in order that they submitted them. So the first question we have here, Jack, is I'm going to read it out to Jack now. If you had included white as one of the groups, would that have provided some useful insights? Why was this not included?
It's not the group that I usually include, to be fair. I mean, I could include it. I don't think I've ever done it before. If there's some value in that, I don't think it would have changed any of the results, to be fair, either in terms of negative or positive opinion, or in terms of hate expression, or in terms of relations. I mean, very often, when people see Black and others, in terms of the relationship, they're making the assumption that it's white, So, but I don't phrase it that way. But it's something that could be considered as a sort of depending on the survey. But I don't think it would have made any meaningful impact on the results, personally. Next.
Okay, and we have a question from an anonymous attendee. Very interesting and important work as always, Jack. What could account for the difference in perceptions between young people 18-25 and older people 55 plus? Any ideas?
Well, my assumption is it depends on, where they're getting their information, which media they're getting information from, or which, thought leaders they're getting their information from, which is not disconnected from whatever media they're consuming, because presumably a lot of media people are consuming, particularly social media, is, rising from thought leaders or other sources. So we have to, in order to better understand that, relating to what Denise asked, actually, in part, we have to ask more questions, whether we're in the position to, invest in asking more questions is something I'll have to sort of keep in mind in terms of whether our resources enable us to do that. But to probe this further, we'd have to ask more questions. But I think I'm actually not dissatisfied with, what we're learning from this sort of first round of survey work. And in particular, what I found, what struck me is that last point, the one that Denise isn't convinced about. I'm actually convinced that there is a relationship between, even though it may be an oversimplification, between the global media focusing on this issue, the issue of what's going on in the Middle East and Israel, Palestine, etc., and and the sort of virtual major diminishing of visualized hate expression towards immigrants, LGBTQ plus, indigenous persons, Black persons, etc. I mean, if I were just coming from outside of the context of what's going on, and I saw that virtually no one seeing any hate expression towards those particular groups, I'd certainly be scratching my head, because we know that there's a fair degree of hostility and animosity towards those groups, and so that's one of the takeaways for me, is how the landscape, if you'd like, and the types of polarities got shifted so much, which I think is an area that provides some useful insights into the way in which we deal with the phenomenon of racism in times of crisis. Chris, next question.
Yep. So we have a question here from Rebecca Newith. Given what seems like a significant spread between awareness of hate directed to Jews versus Palestinians among different age categories, do you think that the definitions of hate or understandings might be different too?
Yeah, I do.
The question is being understood differently among different age groups.
Yeah, I do think there's something to that. I don't think, and that's, a challenge in which I think you've pointed out, an interesting one in doing survey work in this area, is as I sort of said at the outset, it's the choice of terminology, the question formulation, the question selection. I mean, I've tried to keep the question selection consistent with what we've asked previously, because at least we have a benchmark or a basis around which to ask these questions, since they've been asked this way historically, right? But I think you're right, that people do have different understandings of what constitutes hate and what constitutes hate expression. And hate expression can vary across a spectrum too of different types of things, right? So in terms of the way it's measured, for example, by Statistics Canada, it has a wide variation. So we'd almost have to ask that question prior. How do you define hate expression, right? So actually, I've never asked that question, so it may be worth including that in the forthcoming survey. But, again, I'm open to suggestions. This is a challenging exercise, and you want to get it right so you can be able to properly address these issues where, in fact, as you suggest or imply, there are a lot of assumptions about these things. And it's, I think, perfectly accurate to suggest that across that age spectrum and across other demographics, there may be different understandings of what some of these things mean or don't mean.
Thank you. So from Naomi Kramer at JIAS, any understanding of the increase or decrease of negative and positive perceptions between groups? For example, the increase or decrease in negative opinions between Jews and Muslims?
No, again, I don't think, Naomi, thanks for the question. I don't think there has been, which is interesting, there hasn't been necessarily a major change in the last 4 or 5 years and more, actually, of polling we've done in negative or positive opinions of these groups, whether it's Muslims, Jews, or across the board. There've been some shift in terms of opinion of immigrants, more to the negative than what I've seen in previous surveys we've done. But that's why I showed you that table, because I would have assumed that there would be some change in negative and positive opinions, respectively, of the groups, but we haven't seen the change. So what we're seeing in terms of the change, in my opinion, and we need to test this further, is how those views get activated, right? So in other words, are people willing to go from holding a negative view of a particular group, Muslims and Jews in this case respectively, to actually going out and acting on it, either via expressing their views in social media, which is a form of activating that view, or something else, and hopefully something else doesn't, deteriorate into some kind of violent expression, right? But it's the issue of activation. And, there used to be lots of studies. I remember in my undergraduate and graduate day period, we did lots of studies around attitudes versus behaviors, right? So we'd sort of measure the extent to which people hold negative attitudes or positive attitudes, and try to look at the extent to which they behave or their behavior is affected by their attitudes. And that, I think, is what requires more attention currently, going back to sort of some of those types of studies that were conducted more frequently in terms of that relationship. Presumably, we can control for attitudes, although we've seen to some, not completely, obviously, but we've seen, for example, I would suggest around the world, and the U.S. has been a really good example in the sort of post-Trump era. A lot of people who held attitudes that were considered politically incorrect were more inclined not to express their views because they understood that saying such things was politically incorrect. I think we've seen a big shift in that, where people who hold such views that were previously considered politically incorrect no longer feel they're incorrect and express them accordingly. And hence we see in social media a much greater degree of expression of racism and hate than we would have seen, say, when in a previous period where there was more control, for example, in print media on the sort of opinion side or editorial side or letter side of print newspapers. The editors would not allow hate expression. But today it's become increasingly difficult to prevent that because you've got social media that allows people to express themselves freely. And so, we're seeing the sort of expression of such racist or hate, again, depending on how one defines this, far more prevalent through social media, and people are much more exposed. And I've done polling on this, by the way, where I've asked young people in particular, when they see this expression, what do they feel they can do about it? And most of them feel they're powerless to do anything about it because they feel it's far too widespread for us to be able to contain it. So, that's just an observation, but that would be my answer to that. So.
I'm gonna go to John Davis now, who had his hand raised. So John, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question directly to Jack.
Hi, Jack. Can you hear me?
Sure, John.
Hi, Jack. Okay, thanks a lot for this work. Just a question. It's kind of a question about advice for someone who wants to kind of study a similar sort of subject, but also still on the theme of hate expression. As you said quite correctly, it's a term that can be perceived differently by different people and defined differently. But in my understanding, while that is true, if I understand correctly, there is some sort of definition that's kind of within a legal lens of what constitutes hate speech, what constitutes hateful expression. So my question is, moving forward, would you veer towards or away from putting that definition when you ask this question, or would you rather leave it to the participants' subjectivity when they answer that question? Does my question make sense?
No, perfectly. I think because very often in terms of question formulation, we can put a preamble in. Like I'll put preambles in because I very often don't want to assume that people understand what we're referring to, right, when we ask a question, right? So that, I'll explain a particular situation to someone as best as possible without sort of building in an answer, if you'd like, into the preamble to lead people in some direction. So trying to make the preamble as neutral as possible. I don't know that to be fair, and John, I think it's a good point you're making. I don't know that providing the definition of hate in the preamble would necessarily result in people still not understanding or still not defining the term in their own way, right? So hate could be construed in this case as a political criticism of something, could be construed as hate, right? We don't know, maybe or maybe not. So I think we'd have to do it in a more open-ended manner. So we're sort of circling back to what Denise was saying at the front, right? I'd almost have to ask you, if you've seen hate expression, what did it consist of? And then, I'd sort of codify those answers to see whether the people who said they saw hate expression that was in line with that sort of standard definition you're talking about, rather than providing them with the standard definition, right? So, it's actually my takeaway from the Wabinar, right? It's that between what Denise and Rebecca said, that, it's something we probably need to delve into further to get a more precise idea of what, people are thinking. But to your point, John, and I'm glad you asked the question again, I don't know that putting the definition in front in the preamble would work.
Thank you, Jack.
Okay, we have an anonymous question here. Will there be a follow-up survey to determine the persistence of this perceived shift?
Sorry, repeat that, Chris. Was it an anonymous person or anonymous question?
It's I'm not sure how a question can be anonymous. So yes, this anonymous attendee has asked a question.
Okay,
Will there
sorry.
be a follow-up survey? Yeah.
Will there be a follow-up survey?
To determine
believe so.
specifically to determine the persistence of the perceived shift.
Yeah, 100%. I'm pretty sure there will. I don't know what the time frame on it is because there's we're seeing a lot of evolution. So I have to determine what the proper time frame is. Ideally, you'd want to sort of track every sort of week on something like this. But it's I think a lot of survey companies would be reluctant to track on these types of issues because there's a lot of sensitivity around the issue. So measuring this aspect of it isn't something that we're going to, I think, see a lot of necessarily. And even from our point of view, I've got to think about how to do this in a way that is going to give us some effective and useful insights into thinking about the type of policy program and responses needed to address the phenomenon.
Great. We have a question here from Adrian Brefogel. I apologize if I mispronounced your name. In regards to that last chart and the gap, could the participants' own negative bias be affecting their perception of seeing negative, hateful items in the media? For example, they don't view something as hateful because it aligns with their own racist or negative stereotype of that group of people.
Yeah, it's very possible that people will. I mean, and this issue has got a lot of personal resonance and emotion for a lot of people who are connected to the issues and to and are very deeply affected on that personal way. So again, we'd have to it gets back to the same point almost. So we'd have to drill further to understand what their concept and conception understanding is and how they're unpacking the information they're receiving and how it relates to their own sort of personal views of what's going on, right? So that requires a lot more questions. And to be fair, I'm not sure that it can be successfully captured in a big quantitative study. It almost requires qualitative work, right? Or more more micro work than macro work. So more sort of conversations, focus groups, etc., to better understand that. And that's hard to put together in the middle of what's currently going on, right? So usually people will end up doing this thing and they'll sort of generate the results for you of this sort of focus studies over a much longer time frame, so you'll get the results sort of 2 years later. Whereas the nature of our organization is such that at least for these types of things, we're trying to turn information around really, really quickly. And so, what I'm trying to share with you is some of the sort of top line results and show you whether what's consistent or not consistent with some of what we've polled previously, although, there have been some nuances or modifications in this poll. And, ultimately see from some of you what direction you think we can take this in if we go ahead and do more research / polling in this case in that regard. And again, I ask those open-ended questions. I've always found them an interesting way in terms of methodology of getting a little more information beyond the sort of top line answer. So it's beyond the sort of yes, no, very positive or negative or worried or not worried. Let's get a little more information. And we do that with those open-ended questions. So in theory, I could have asked, why are you more worried in an open-ended question, right, about this relationship? Or why do you have a positive or negative opinion of those groups? That would be interesting. It would require more analysis and more resources. It's not out of the question to do something along those lines, and and not necessarily tomorrow, but maybe at some point in the future we'll have to see.
On a une question en français de Gassan. Peut-être que vous en avez parlé au début de la présentation, mais pourriez-vous rappeler comment les répondants ont-ils été choisis?
Encore, c'est un échantillonnage qui correspond aux caractéristiques démographiques telles que identifiées par Statistique Canada lors du dernier recensement. C'est une méthodologie standard de léger marketing basée, comme j'ai dit, sur les caractéristiques démographiques de la population. So it's a standard methodological, design that Léger bases on the profile of Canadians as it's presented in the census by Statistics Canada for 2021, and there's weighting, right? So they'll weight. So that, if they, for example, got a high number of people in the younger cohort relative to the older cohort who responded to the web panel, they're going to redistribute when they weight the unweighted counts according to the actual population, a percentage of the population which each of those demographics represents.
Nous avons un commentaire de Denise qui, en fait, montre que la différence entre l'opinion négative sur la religion et les fidèles de cette religion montre qu'en fait, il n'y a pas d'amalgame entre les individus d'une religion et cette religion. Est-ce que vous confirmez?
Oui, il n'y a pas d'amalgame. Ceci dit, j'ai d'autres diapositifs que j'étais supposé d'inclure dans la présentation et je m'excuse. Je vais probablement les poster la semaine prochaine sur notre site web, qui montre le degré auquel les gens qui tiennent des opinions négatives ou positives des musulmans, par exemple, ou du judaïsme, de l'islam ou du judaïsme, ont des opinions positives ou négatives des juifs et des musulmans respectivement. Right? Alors, j'avais comme 4 diapositives pour montrer cet amalgame et le degré auquel cet amalgame se présente. Et justement, ceux qui ont dit, par exemple, qu'ils ont une vue très négative de l'islam, disproportionnellement, ont une opinion très négative des musulmans, et même chose pour le judaïsme. Ceux qui ont une opinion très négative du judaïsme ont une opinion disproportionnellement très négative envers les juifs, mais il y a des écarts et une différence entre l'opinion des juifs et l'opinion négative positive du judaïsme à l'envers, qui est différente. Mais Denise, je vais t'envoyer ça cette fin de semaine et je vais le poster la semaine prochaine. Ah, vous voyez, c'est là. Excellent, merci. Je ne sais pas, c'est Chris qui a fait ça?
Naj.
Naj, très bien, Naj. Naj Medine, je veux dire. Alors, ça, Denise, pour répondre à la question, right, on voit que ceux qui disent qu'ils ont une opinion très positive des Juifs, right, ou très, excuse-moi, mettons très négative des Juifs, right, sont à 98% en opinion négative du judaïsme. À l'inverse, ceux qui ont une opinion très négative du judaïsme n'ont pas un aussi négatif, même si la majorité, 53%, ont une opinion négative des juifs, ce n'est pas aussi négatif que le contexte inverse. Et c'est la même chose pour les musulmans et l'islam. Right? Si je peux changer, Najmadine, est-ce que tu peux me le montrer? C'est dans...
c'est celle-ci?
Non, ça c'est islam, et j'ai fait la même chose pour islam et musulmans.
Just a second. Non, c'est celle qu'on a pour l'instant, malheureusement.
Okay, but it's in the next slide. Let's go to slide number 12 or 11. It's in 11. You're showing me number 11 or 12?
This is, we have about 12. This is the 12.
Yeah, that's it. It's correct. Okay, so let's see the same thing here, right? You're seeing that if you have a high negative opinion of Canadian Muslims, very negative, then 89% of the people who say that have a very negative opinion of Islam. But, it's softer in the inverse, right? So if you have a negative opinion of Islam, it does not mean, to the same degree anyways, even though it's still negative, that you have as negative opinion as Muslims. There's sort of some people say, like, I don't like Islam, but 1 out of 5, I do like Muslims, even if I have a very negative opinion of Islam, right? So contrary to the inverse, the same for Judaism and Jews. You're seeing those, those distinctions. There's another slide I wanted to show, but anyways, we're running out of time. So it was the one about the sort of net concern. So the people are saying, they were, just to let you know, who said they had a very high level of concern about relations Jews and Muslims, were the ones that were more likely to, by far, to see they saw hate expression in the media directed at, hate expression generally in the media over the past 3 weeks. Again, was much more likely to be observed by people who are very worried about these relationships. People who weren't as worried about these relationships were not seeing as much hate expression. So it's the expression of hate that's creating, in other words, more concern or fear about those relations, or the extent to which people see it. The more you see it, it's not counterintuitive. The more to which you're seeing these hate expressions in the media is contributing to a greater degree of concern about those relationships. So, as many of you have been watching what's going on in the news 24/7, I had a 12-hour break from the news last week because at our conference in Calgary, because we did it for Metropolis, and I actually felt a lot better in those 12. I didn't feel as much anxiety in those 12 hours that I didn't have access to news media at all. So it shows you that the anxiety that's created and the concern that's created. I'm not suggesting not watching the news is a good thing, by the way, because then you're uninformed. So I don't want to make that. I'm not making that suggestion to anybody. So.
Jack, we're at the end now. I just want to say that we did have 8 of the questions. I guess we'll respond to them by email. So I don't know if you want to wrap up now, Jack.
Yeah, so let me wrap up. So thanks very much, everybody, and I very much appreciate your participation, and we're open to all suggestions. I'd like to continue doing more research in this area, despite sort of the challenges associated with doing the research, and maybe expand on it. And very much welcome any suggestions in that regard. And my thanks, and wishing everybody a very good weekend, and look forward to future webinars. Are we copying the questions or whatever?
I'll save the questions, Jack.
Perfect. And we have the sort of addresses of these people who've asked these questions, right?